Cool. Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for showing up to another one of Helios AI's monthly webinar series. Today, we are hosting a webinar on brewing uncertainty, what's next for beer's key ingredients, with two wonderful panelists. Real quick call out that we apologize, our third panelist had to drop out last minute, but rest assured, we have two really great folks on the line here with us today. So I will hand it over to Francisco to kick us off.
Thanks so much, Sabrina. Welcome. Thank you again for being coming in and listening to our monthly webinar. We're super excited to be talking with Randy Brown. Randy Brown is a former kind of senior leader in the category insights business at Molson Coors. He now runs Randy Brown Consulting. And what we really want to talk about today is, what does the outlook look like for beer's key ingredients? As I was preparing kind of for this webinar today, it's a beautiful day here in Virginia. The weather is just changing. And one of the things that I love most about beer, not to sound too much like a college person, is just the real versatility that exists in it. And, Randy and I were talking about it. It's remarkable that, as the weather gets colder, you want maybe a nice Guinness. As it gets warmer, you want a nice Modelo. If you're working out or something, maybe you want a non-alcoholic beer. But there is such a wonderful variety that exists across the spectrum of different types of beer. I don't think that type of variety exists in any other alcoholic beverage. But Randy, it's so wonderful to have you. Thank you so much for being here. Super excited to kick off. So off the bat, what do you love most about beer? Before we get into the less interesting conversation, right? Tell us what you love most about it.
It's probably similar to you, Francisco, in regards to like occasion, right? Beer is very occasion based, and a lot of people will, kind of figure out, hey, what do I want to really consume today based off of the occasion? Is it a social occasion where you're meeting maybe 10 or 12 people? Is it a celebration where you're celebrating maybe a birthday or anniversary or something? Is it more of a relaxed occasion, which is maybe just yourself potentially? Or is it maybe a small group, kind of a connection? So to me, that's kind of, I think, what I've really always enjoyed about beer is having that social aspect and that social occasion to it. And to be honest, I'm not a huge beer drinker myself. But I've worked for iconic brands like a Coors Banquet, like a Coors Light, like a Miller Lite, and then other on the wine and spirit side as well. But I mean, to me, it's just, and I'm more on the analytics and insight side. So to me, it's understanding like why people drink what they drink, the stories behind that. To me, that's always been interesting. And I think that's where, for me, in my career, I've kind of gravitated to that. It's kind of uncovering those insights, understanding the reasons why, and then building stories based off of that to either help the marketing team or sales team be able to, kind of sell that in. So at the end of the day, it's really kind of the stories behind it and the reasons why people drink it.
Yeah, and that's so interesting, right? Because if you look at a lot of the reasons, I think, around the consumption of beer specifically, right, is this idea of social cohesion, right, celebratory moments, et cetera. But one of the things that we find really interesting is that your sales numbers for beer overall, right, and I'm sure there's some nuance that, Randy, you can talk about, continue to go up, but the volume is declining. And so can you help us understand what's the nuance there, what's going on?
Yeah, and it's interesting, there's just been a continual increase in beer prices, right? Every year, a supplier will, tack on a few extra cents, $1, 50 cents, whatever it might be, for specific pack sizes for specific brands. And given we're in a 3-tiered system here in the US for beer, if the supplier adds, dollars to the cost of that product, and the distributor will do the same, and then potentially the retailer will do the same, and the consumer ends up paying an extra 50 cents or $1 more. So like the dollar sales of beer have continued to go up, whereas the volume, to your point, Francisco, is either remains steady or actually is declining. So it's just this premiumization aspect. A lot of it has to do with the actual mix in product being sold, right? If you're selling more above premium products and a little bit less premium, a little bit less economy, then of course the dollar sales go up, but the volume itself most likely is going down. And I think that's been what beer has been doing over the last 3 to 4 years. Like there's just been a bit of a mask of the true volume aspects of what's going on in beer. based off of the increase in sales prices. So
Yeah.
it's one of the things that I think I've looked at, a lot of people have looked at, it's volume decreases. And it's like, well, if the volume is declining, well, then the occasions as to why people are drinking, that's declining as well. And at the end of the day, I think there's been an adjustment, I think, in internal and external performance goals and the communication of that, especially up to, Wall Street. And there used to be maybe a 4 to 5% top line growth expectation every quarter. That's, I think, gone at this point in time.
Yeah.
And the
And
continued. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, Randy, exactly to that point, right? And we'll come back to this premiumization kind of point that I think is really interesting. Do you think that part of the reason for this are, kind of social or behavioral changes? And then coupled with, if it is getting more and more expensive, it becomes more of an optional thing. You're doing less of, or you're just not doing it all as you look at kind of your broad inflation across your different food and beverage basket. I mean, are those two of the main drivers you think that are part of it, or are there other things?
For sure. I mean, there's a lot of headwinds right now in regards to what's going on with beer and alcohol in general, right? I think when you look at just price itself, there's a lot of price elasticity around specific pack sizes and brands, right? Like a premium, which is maybe a Miller Lite or Coors Light 24 pack, a 30 pack, for the most part, tends to be the most price sensitive pack size in an area. So raising price on that, the stomach for that from consumers is a lot less than would be for raising price on maybe a Modelo 12 pack or a Guinness 12 pack or whatever it might be, right? There's more room for that. But you eventually suppress demand by increasing your price over and over and over. And that slows down penetration of beer consumption as well. And, that fewer households buying at the end of the day, there's some long-term risk there. And that's where, even on the retailer side, you see some retailers de-emphasizing beer. It's not growing. Why would I throw more promotional dollars towards a category that's not growing? That doesn't make as much sense from a retailer perspective. They're putting more dollars towards those specific categories that are growing. But you also run the risk. Beer's such a huge traffic driver. It tends to be number 1, 2, or 3 category, depending upon the area as far as like traffic driving. If you're not continuing to drive that traffic, if you're putting more resources towards the number 28th and 82nd, 102nd largest category in your grocery store, it's tough to make up that traffic and it's tough to make up those dollars. So it's kind of a risk reward, right? At some point in time, you have to be very cognizant of that 3-tiered system. And really it's a 4th tier when you kind of take into account the consumer behavior piece of taking your price up too much. And to your point as well, like there's some structural changes going on right now in regards to just beer consumption, right? You have kind of that health and wellness focus right now. And that's, across every age group, but it probably maybe tends to be a little bit more with Gen Z. And Gen Z, there's more experimentation as far as what they're drinking throughout the evening, throughout that occasion. They might go from a beer to a non-alcoholic beer to a mocktail to a cocktail, then maybe back to a non-alc beer and a beer and water mixed in. So it's just a very different, session for maybe Gen Z than what it was for the millennial generation or the Gen X or baby boomers, where it was like you sat down and you drank one thing and you drank that until you were full and you went someplace else or whatever, that was it. So that part is interesting as well in regards to just those structural changes going on from a health and wellness perspective for different age groups right now. And with Gen Z, it's not like you're able to capture that volume with them during that age 21 to, let's say, 28. We are seeing older Gen Z, maybe that 28, 29, 30, that age range. Once they get up there, they're consuming similar to other age groups in the past, right? Like that part is happening.
So that experimentation you talked about kind of starts to disappear, and you almost revert to the mean, the earlier mean, or
yeah, there is definitely a lot of that happening, right there, and it's also affordability too, right? Like you do have Gen Z that doesn't have the same buying power right now than maybe the previous generation. So beer for the most part tends to be a little bit maybe less expensive than wine and spirits, but at the end of the day, maybe they only have $20 they want to spend for that evening. So how far can they make that go? But at the end of the day, they're not really just focusing on alcohol consumption during that entire time, right? They're kind of mixing and matching. So, but we do see them regress towards the mean. But let's say from age 21 to 28, you're not going to recapture that volume with that group until later on, until they're after 28. So you have 7 years or 8 years where that volume
missing out on.
Yeah. And it's not like you can make it up with an older generation, which is already tapped out. And the older generation, they're focused on, hey, there's more moderation going on now. A lot of their consumption is, I think there's messages coming to them about health, right? And that's about weight, and it's about physical health, and it's about, okay, I probably don't want to consume the same amount that I was consuming in the past because I want to make sure I'm living longer and I'm not overexposing myself to alcohol, whatever it might be. So
yeah.
It's
well,
tough
you had
to
the
make
Surgeon
that line.
General's warning. Was it last year or a year ago?
Yeah.
That was surprising. How did that? Was it? I mean, they were saying basically like any alcohol is negative now, but how did that impact the beer industry?
It impacted the alcohol industry altogether, but same thing for beer. I think the beer suppliers, it's not like they didn't see that, right? They looked at it, they said, hey, this can have a potential negative effect on us, but it wasn't like they were spending a lot of time talking about it. Or you probably don't want to spend too much time bringing more of that to light, right? But it's something, at least when I was with Molson Coors, we spent time looking at to say, okay, how much can this really have an effect on beer consumption? It certainly had some, and it still has some. And it's something that you have to pay attention to it, right? It's another headwind that's out there in regards to negative press on alcohol consumption.
Yeah, it is really interesting, right? Because so much of the conversation we're having is a lot of relatively difficult headwinds in the industry. But going back to your earlier point on the premiumization, is that still the dominant story, right? Can we continue to have, I don't know what the right terminology, right? But if your premium is your Coors Light, your Bud Light, is there super premium, right? Are we seeing more growth in whatever the fancy IPA that you can get at Trader Joe's or Whole Foods or something?
Yeah, I mean, that had been the story, and there still is a story there. But given the state of the economy and just kind of what's going on there in regards to buying power and affordability, you certainly have seen some people trade down from an above premium to a premium or premium to economy, or they're trading down in pack sizes, right? Maybe they were buying a Modelo 6-pack or Corona 12 pack. Now they've traded down to a 6-pack, or maybe even going from a 6-pack to a 3-pack or even a single, whatever it might be. You've definitely seen, some of that as well. So, that's where,
go ahead.
Like portfolio optimization, having options for every one of those occasions, it helps lessen your risk in regards to what can go on with the beer industry, right? I mean, I think a lot of the big guys, they have that ability, right? They are very well positioned from a portfolio perspective to kind of, really weather a lot of these changes. If you're someone in the craft business where maybe you're just IPA specific, or maybe you're IPA and lager, whatever it might be, you're just craft, right? And the craft business right now, as we all know, is, it's in a tough spot. That has declined over the years. And I think when you're really focused on maybe one or two different types of a product, it definitely increases your risk and ability to kind of weather a lot of these headwinds right now.
Yeah. And how much fungibility is there to your earlier point? So if you're used to buying a 12-pack of Modelo, do you typically shift to a Coors Light or a Bud Light, or even between those premium brands? Or is your typical decision, instead of just buying less, instead of buying more of something that is different or cheaper?
It depends. I mean, it's different across the country. There's some areas in which you have some trade down from an above premium to a premium or premium to economy. But there's a lot of loyalty to specific brands too. So it's not like they're necessarily willing to go from one to the other. The interesting thing is, even in the premium world of a Coors Light, a Miller Lite, and a Bud Light, or you could even count Coors Banquet and Budweiser in there as well, there's a lot of loyalty. It's interesting. Like
Yeah.
Coors Light buyers don't necessarily go to Miller Lite. Budweiser buyers don't necessarily go to Coors Banquet or Bud Light. Like they stick with their brand.
Yeah.
So that's where, if you go to a store, you need to have those products out there, right? The assortment. And need to have all that assortment. You need to have different pack sizes. And, sometimes retailers like, why do I need all these specific pack sizes of one brand? Well, it's based off of occasion, right? And it's based off of loyalty. And it's also helping the retailer, I think, stem and be able to get through some of these headwinds and offer a solution that's right there. Because if they don't have it, that customer is going to go someplace else, right? To find it for the most part, because they're very loyal to that beer. And if they don't have it, or if they don't have that specific pack size you're looking for, off they go. You lose that sale, which isn't what you want.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. To your point, right? I think one of the things that we're tracking here at Helios is obviously there's this dual shock that we're seeing. We've seen, we mean this apolitically, right? We've just seen kind of inflation seems to be ticking up again. We're in this kind of low fire type environment, but those are just macroeconomic forces. The thing we're tracking at Helios, right, is that dual shock to the food system where you've got, we'll talk about it in more depth, right? But you don't have a lot of the fertilizer that you expect coming out of Qatar, especially, and blocked by the Strait of Hormuz crisis. So that's out, and then you have obviously higher transportation costs coming through. If this ends up leading to a recession, again, we're not making that view. We're just putting that scenario out there. What typically happens to beer sales during a recession?
In previous years, like alcohol, whether your spirits, wine, beer, was recession resistant, right? You were able to get through the recession, and overall consumption didn't change that much. And hell, in some cases, it actually increased. It was always interesting to see that. I don't know if that's going to be the case anymore, just given everything that's going on within alcohol, right? Again, with the health and wellness aspect. You even have other alternatives out there, where that's THC or hemp-based, type products. A lot of adjacent categories out there that is more serving that non-alc consumer as well. Functional beverage. There's a health benefit or some sort of benefit to functional beverage. Alcohol doesn't necessarily have much of a health benefit besides maybe red wine. So, there's definitely some aspects to that. And, in the non-alc piece for beer is interesting because it had always been out there, but it were, brands like Sharps and O'Doul's. It's like, the taste might not have been where you wanted it to be. So it wasn't really a great option. Now it's very different, right? And you had a brand like Athletic who came into the market in which non-alc was everything they did. They didn't have a parent brand that was alcoholic. It was just Athletic beer, non-alc, right? And then with the success that they've had, all the big guys followed suit and said, okay, we need a non-alcoholic version of one of our mainstream brands, right? You had Heineken 0.0. You have Peroni jumped on with their Blue Moon, and you have Michelob Ultra came out with theirs, Guinness. There's tons of different examples. Corona has theirs, tons of different examples out there. But the big part was trying to match that taste profile of the non-alc version to the alcoholic version. And I think earlier renditions of some of these parent brands that did that, it wasn't a great match. That's changed. I think the taste profile is there now, and it certainly helped beer, if you will, kind of look at that as like one of the green shoots that's available within the industry.
And Randy, is that like the new craft movement, right? So do you think you'll see a lot of that innovation in the non-alc space, or?
It's funny because it's still less than 3% of the overall beer category, right? It's still very small in regards to overall sales and volume. However, it is growing, and it's one of the few segments within beer that is growing. So there's an inordinate amount of focus on it from retailers, from suppliers, from consumers, because it is something new. And, I think there's some romanticism, kind of behind it as well. It's like, okay, a non-alcoholic version of my favorite beer tastes pretty good. It's like, I don't have to really worry about any type of hangover with it, whatever it might be. So, it makes sense. And it certainly will continue to grow. Now, will it ever be a 10% of the beer business or 12%? It could.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
I thought it was already at that 10 to 12% because you hear so much about it, right? But it's only at 3. Wow.
Yeah, and in some areas it's less than 1%. And again, it depends upon where you're at and what the assortment is, and I think just where those brands have done well, but it's still pretty small. But yes, it is. It gets an inordinate amount of focus because there's a lot of talk around it, but it's still relatively small. But as a retailer, for example, you're focusing on it because it is one of those green shoots, and RTDs, the same thing. RTDs is ready to drink, spirit based. It's not in the beer segment per se, but it's adjacent to it, and it certainly has taken some of the volume from beer, especially. It's really craft drinkers and it's flavored drinkers, maybe a hard seltzer drinker or a flavored malt beverage drinker. They've kind of maybe switched over to RTD as well. And it's definitely siphoned some of that business from the beer side. So, and there's more and more focus on that in regards to retailer attention, in regards to beer suppliers buying up those RTD brands to kind of fit in their portfolio, because that was a white space they didn't really were able to address. So, and Molson Coors just did that themselves. They ended up, picking up Monaco recently, and it helped fill in the gap that they had. And ABI did it with Beatbox and Cutwater, so they've kind of filled that out. So yeah, you have a lot of beer suppliers looking to see, okay, what's growing, what makes sense to potentially fit into our portfolio, and does it make sense to try to grow it organically, build it your own, or does it make sense to acquire someone that's already done all that work, and then you can just kind of tap into your own distribution network and be able to continue that success.
Yeah, which is a huge competitive advantage, right? I mean, these existing distribution networks. Does the consumer profile of the people buying non-alcoholic versus alcoholic beer, what are the characteristics? How differentiated is it?
It's funny. I think the last stat I saw was 80% of non-alcoholic buyers also buy beer. So there's a lot of crossover from that. Now, the non-alcoholic buyer might be buying beer for someone in the family, or not for themselves, or if they're going to again, based off of the occasion, they're going to a social occasion or celebratory occasion, they might buy that. But non-alcoholic tends to be a little bit younger. They tend to be a little bit more affluent from an income perspective, a little bit more educated. It kind of matches what you would expect maybe from an above premium type purchaser. They do a lot of that. We didn't see as much like buying from maybe different ethnic groups per se. Didn't see a lot from maybe Latino. Didn't see as much from Asian or Black. But again, I would expect that to increase as there's more options that come out that might fit their flavor profile.
Yeah, as you start to expand. That's super interesting. So folks, please continue to put your questions into the chat. A question here is, if you're a category manager in the business, I think this question is for Randy. How would you look at the next 2 to 5 years at building out that broader portfolio?
The big part is still going to be portfolio optimization, right? Trying to make sure that you're matching really what's going on in the industry. And I think it's smart for a lot of, and again, this is probably more for the big guys, but I think if you're a mid-tier player or even a smaller player, it's broadening that portfolio a little bit and including some non-alc options as well. If you're not diving into that non-alc space, it definitely, I think, limits you to your ability to really capture that entire occasion of your consumer base, right? Because we still have more and more folks going that route. So portfolio optimization is going to be key. Price optimization is going to be key as well. Leading into those revenue management growth principles to understand price elasticities, to understand price pack curves. What is the right optimal price points on those, and then it's also funding. Really those big players and making sure that you're not losing sight on your core. Innovation is key. Don't get me wrong, but innovation, it's been historically really around 3 to 4% of beer's business each year, right? It's going up a little bit, but most of the innovation, let's be honest, isn't new to the world type innovation. It's very much a line extension, of something that already exists, right? You take a look at maybe Modelo, they came out with their Oro, which was their gold. It's like, well, there's already 1,000 Modelos out there. Okay, here's another version of that. That's classifies innovation, but at the end of the day, it's just another line extension of what already exists. Same thing for hard seltzers and FMBs. You had a pineapple last year, now you have a lime. Last year you had a peach, now you have a raspberry. It's like, okay, yes, that's innovation, but at the end of the day,
margins really.
Yeah, it's just there's not a lot of what I would call true innovation out there. Now, when hard seltzers came out, and White Claw kind of getting behind that and really pushing it, that was true innovation. And you saw that hard seltzer share of the category really spike. But now it's very much kind of stabilized, and you have White Claw still the king, if you will, of hard seltzers, and you have brands like Truly and Topo Chico that have done pretty well as well, but they're relatively small, right? It's White Claw is the king. Same thing for even with, like, again, going back to RTDs, like High Noon did really well, and they kind of captured a significant portion of that overall category. And you have tons of new players that have come in, but I think what happens, you have innovation, and then it's usually one or two brands that kind of take the lion's share, and then you have a relatively long tail of a whole bunch of other brands, and it's like, okay, you kind of become a Me Too player, right? And that's where you have to balance that. Do you want to be a Me Too player, or do you want to be first to market or second to market on something new, right? Balancing that's going to be key. But I will say the innovation within beer is a lot less now than what it was even 3 years ago, in regards to the number of products out there. And a lot of it is just due to suppliers being a little bit, I think, more risk averse, if you will, when it comes to their portfolio. They're really focusing on those core brands because that's what pays the bills. And you certainly don't want to take your foot off the gas on that. And that's where the steadiness is, if you will. And you kind of want to have a couple green shoots here and there to help offset some losses elsewhere. But if you're like Molson Coors, where 2/3 of your overall sales come from two brands, it's like, you certainly can't take your foot off the gas of those two brands, because that's what funds the company.
Yeah. And I wonder on that innovation point, going back to the Iran war, what we really worry about, and we've written a lot about this, is, I think 20 to 30% of all the world's fertilizer is going through the Strait of Hormuz, right? Coming from the Gulf. And that there's a lot of nuance in that number, right? It's 50% of the urea comes from the Strait of Hormuz. If you're in Australia, 70% of the urea that you need, that you're not getting right now, actually comes from the Strait of Hormuz. So if you're growing wheat, it's just not happening right now. But what's interesting about the United States specifically, right, is we're very lucky that I think we produce 75% of all the fertilizer that we need domestically, but we are still tied to global prices. And so, when we look at fertilizer prices, I think we were in the high 300s, low 400s last year. We're now in the high 600s. And so what we're hearing across a lot of our barley customers is they're actively making decisions. Do we plant more barley or not? We can't use as much fertilizer as you used to. We expect broadly, right, 12 to 18% inflation, kind of through the end of the year into 2027. But if you're already looking at a business that has, a lot of these headwinds, what does that typically do to behavior and margins, Randy, right? Because if you're looking at a 50% increase in one of your input costs, if it's fertilizer, right, or 100% increase if the strait remains closed for a long time, I mean, eventually your growers, right, have to pass that through. You can eat some of that as a beer producer, but eventually your customers have to eat some of that. Or do you think we're at the stage where a lot of these beer producers are just going to have to eat more of that price increase given some of these headwinds?
Big guys can absorb it, I think, a lot easier than maybe the smaller players out there, right? And even going back to, again, like the innovation strategy, for example, it's like if your beer innovation is tied to an existing parent brand, it probably reduces that procurement friction a little bit, right? The speed, the cost, the supplier access is probably a little bit easier. But if your innovation all of a sudden shifts more towards adjacent spaces, where that's flavors or different functions, non-alc, cross-category, there's more complexity to it. So that's one of the things you have to weigh in regards to that, especially when the cost keeps on increasing for some of those core ingredients. But maybe there are some ingredients where, hey, like fertilizer isn't as necessary potentially, or it doesn't include barley, wheat, so it's like, okay, like, there could be some options there to help mitigate some of those costs. But those are the things I think you have to pay attention to, is like, okay, from an overall portfolio perspective, it's like, where can I potentially really lean into some of those optimization I've already built out? And if I'm going to maybe go a little bit different from an innovation standpoint or portfolio standpoint, add a couple things to it, it's like, okay, what really makes sense right now? Because I think in the past, when those prices were pretty steady, that might not have been a significant input to that decision-making process. Right now, hopefully that is one of the things you're thinking about in regards to, hey, like, what does it really make sense for us to do from a portfolio perspective? Do we expand it? Do we hold tight? And if we're going to hold tight, how do we really lean into the optimization we've already built in regards to all the different procurement costs that are out there?
Yeah, it is interesting just how much more proactive you have to be these days based on all of the different crises and inputs. We were speaking with a global procurement manager. He's been in the business for 15 years or so, buys over $1 billion of a lot of these agricultural commodities globally. He said this is before the war, he said the last 2 months of his professional career have been the worst 2 months of his career. It's just the level of disruption that occurs, right? And I think that puts a lot of the onus on these teams, right, to innovate a lot more, really have an understanding of what the input costs are across your different ingredients, your different margins. But also, to your point, where are you sourcing all of this from? How much of it is protected? How much of it will be impacted? And then similar to the United States, right? You might have availability, you might not be able to afford it, and or you might not have availability if things get really bad. I know we're a few minutes over, but I want to make sure we get to one last question here. If non-alcoholic keeps growing, does barley demand actually drop, or does the ingredient mix just get more complicated?
I mean, you would expect it to drop a little bit, right? I mean, just given that's not a core ingredient to non-alc, but I still, non-alc again is, I don't believe that to be, again, a 10 or 12% part of the business for the foreseeable future, right? It's just not there when it comes to the consumption, right? And then I think that the mix that you have right now of brands and different pack sizes and everything, it's starting to become maybe a little bit too much almost, because you only need so much in regards to non-alc varieties out there before it becomes a little bit oversaturated, right? You saw that for hard seltzer, right? You saw that, you've seen that now for RTDs, you're seeing that even for flavored malt beverage, right? All of a sudden that was a green shoot. Everyone starts to focus on that. We need a version of that as well. You become a Me Too player. All you're doing is adding on to this long tail, right, of options. And if you're a retailer, maybe your section of non-alc is 4x6, right? How many brands and pack sizes can you really fit in that, right? And are you going to focus on brand number 50? Or are you going to focus on brands 1 through 8 that deliver 95% of the sales, right? I mean, as a retailer, that's what you're focused on. You're not as focused on those smaller brands, unless it's a local player or a regional player and you have a great relationship with them and you want to feature it. Sure, that makes sense. But for the most part, you're just focused on those top brands. And I would expect barley to really kind of benefit from this to a certain degree. But again, we're still talking small percentages. If non-alc became 50% of the beer category, very different
totally
story.
New world. Yeah.
And non-alc is, and I'm looking at it from a U.S. perspective because that's what, I tend to really focus on. But non-alc, it's not just the U.S., right? It has definitely had an impact everywhere. But I think, at least in the U.S., it seems like, in the U.K., I would say as well, that's where I think most of the talk has been, and that's where most of that focus has been in regards to just suppliers and jumping on board, and then retailers jumping on board as well.
Yeah. So I know we're over time, but just one last question for me, and a huge thank you. And obviously, any last thoughts, Brandy? What is the largest consumer of beer? I don't know if on a volume or a per capita basis.
As far as like country or?
Yeah, I be interesting.
The last time I think it was like Poland. It was somewhere in the Eastern
Yeah.
European markets. Maybe it was even Czechia. That it's just
Yeah.
it was there was a huge
It's
huge
never
concern.
Germany, right? I think we.
Oh well,
That's what we-
Germany was up there, but there were some smaller nations where that, and
Yeah.
frankly, it's probably some tiny nation, to be honest, that really does a
Yeah.
huge consumption of that. But yeah.
Well, Randy, thank you so much for the time and the insights. Any last thoughts? Anything? I'm happy to leave you with the last word.
You mentioned the complexity, right? The complexity of the beer business, and it's now become what seems like a lot more complex than what it's been in the past. And it's like I'm sure every generation of beer makers and brewers have said the same thing, right? It's beer is so much more complex now than what it was 10 years ago or 15 years ago, and some of that I think is in jest, but I really truly believe right now, like that beer making process, all the different decisions you have to make, all the different inputs that are out there. I think we are in the most complex part of that right now in today's society because there's just so much more going on. And really, when you have that complexity within your organization, I think the biggest thing that you have to really make sure is you have a culture within your organization that is willing to, I think, move off of the norms, right? It's like things have changed. You need to have people within the organization that are really flexible and really to adapt and are super inquisitive and just want to understand, okay, I know we used to do things this way and it really worked well, but it's not the same now. Like, what can we do internally to make things, optimize things better than what we have, right? And that's where every functional area has to be, I think, on board with that same type of culture and same type of thought process. We're like, can't lean on what you did in the past because that's not working as much or as well. You need to have that ability to kind of be flexible, adapt, ask those questions, understand how can we do things better. Otherwise, it's going to make things even more difficult when you have kind of a process that's set in stone and just doing the same thing you've always done, right? Like, it's worked. It probably got you to the growth that you've seen today and where you're at right now, but you might not be able to see that same growth in the future if you're not willing to make those changes.
Yeah. That makes a ton of sense. And those are excellent last words to leave us with. Again, Randy, thank you so much. Everybody who joined, thank you so much for being here. It's a real pleasure, and have a wonderful rest of the week.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Francisco.